Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan, and today I'm going to be sharing with you my 10 favorite science fiction series of all time. So whether you're looking for some big sci-fi ideas, a plot-forward sci-fi journey, or something that's a little bit more character-focused, there should be something on this list for you. So let's get into them, starting with number 10, The Expanse. So we're kicking things off with a longer series as there are 9 novels in The Expanse. There are also some novellas and short stories, but throughout this video, I'm going to be focusing on the primary books in a series just to keep things a little bit simpler, and I may not have read all the add-ons for each of the different universes. So The Expanse has 9 books that I think are incredibly readable. I think the plotting and pacing in these books are great, and I would recommend them to someone that is newer to science fiction as well as a more experienced science fiction reader. Even though the books are around 500 pages long each, I never felt like they were slow. I never felt like reading The Expanse was a chore. I was always having fun. I was always having a good time. Except maybe book 6, Babylon's Ashes. That one was a tiny bit of a slog to get through because it introduces a lot of POVs and there was quite a lot going on. But otherwise, most of the books have between 2 and 4 POVs, and I think the characterization is a strength of this series. I typically enjoyed most of those POVs, and it was pretty satisfying seeing how those storylines come together throughout each of the books. So the setup for The Expanse is that we have people living on Earth, people living on Mars, and people living farther out in an area known as the Belt. And the relationships between these factions are somewhat tenuous. So we have some rather interesting political maneuvering, power dynamics. There's a lot going on here. There's a lot at play. And I think what drives The Expanse are the people, the conversations, the ideas. But there is some pretty cool action, certain moments that pay off through action throughout this series. So when I say this, these books are fast-paced, I think sometimes people get the idea of this pew-pew military sci-fi action, and there is a little bit of that, but I think if you're looking for something that relies mostly on people and relationships, that's something that you're going to find in The Expanse. I think when I compare this to other series in terms of my emotional reaction or my mind just being blown by the sci-fi ideas, it doesn't quite reach the heights as some of the other series that are higher than The Expanse on this list. But in terms of being fun and readable and enjoyable and consistent, I think The Expanse delivers on that, with my personal favorite books being the first one, Leviathan Wakes, and the penultimate book, Tiamat's Wrath. Number 9, Teixcalaan by Arkady Martin. So we are reeling things back a little bit here with a duology. There are just 2 books in the Teixcalaan series, and I would recommend this one to anyone that is interested in culture and philosophy and language, as these are some things that the Teixcalaan series really dives into. The premise for this story is that an ambassador from an independent station travels to the capital of a galaxy that is Teixcalaan. Unfortunately for them, however, they are replacing the previous ambassador that died under mysterious circumstances. So we have this fish out of water story, them trying to adapt to this different culture with a different naming system. Poetry is part of society and your status and things like that, as well as trying to navigate this murder mystery and all of the potential political pitfalls of being ambassador. This one did take me a little while to get into, as there is quite a lot of technobabble, and the naming conventions make it a little bit hard to remember and recognize everybody's names, but once I got into it, I did end up having a really good time. I slightly preferred the first book, although I did think the second book did some things well. It expanded the scope a little bit, it was pretty ambitious in terms of some of the ideas, but I think it just lost some of the charm of the character relationships and moments that I thought were executed really well in the first book, but definitely a worthy sequel, and I highly recommend checking out the duology. Number 8, Dune by Frank Herbert. So there is a larger Dune universe, but I'm going to focus on the books that I have read, and those are the 6 Dune books written by Frank Herbert. Now, Dune might not need an introduction, but it is primarily set on the planet of Arrakis, and we follow our main character Paul Atreides, who is the son of a duke of House Atreides. And this house, as well as other powerful houses and other factions, are all kind of vying for control over the planet of Arrakis and this spice that it produces, and some of the mysterious properties that can be found when taking the spice. Now, Dune might have some of the richest world building in all of science fiction. when it comes to the history of this planet, the ecology, the religion of the local people, as well as all the kind of different political maneuverings between the people that are competing for control over Arrakis. It doesn't get more detailed than the Dune series. That's why so many people list it as their favorite book. So many people can just immerse themselves in it and read it over and over and over again and find something new to enjoy and learn on each and every reread. I think there are some interesting moments throughout the story of Dune, and I think there are some engaging characters, but for me, the strength of the Dune series was the themes and the ideas. There's so much to dive into, to think about. The philosophical dialogue I found to be very stimulating, and there's so much that you can learn from these books, as well as things to take note of to be wary of the dangers of. An interesting thing about this series is that while the series is continuous, I feel like each of the books come to a relatively satisfying breaking point, so you could just read 1 or 2 or 3 and so on. For me, I was a pretty big fan of the first 4 books, but then 5 and 6, for me, were a little bit less satisfying. So I tried not to ding it too much for those last 2 books because I think 4 somewhat completes a story arc that's relatively satisfying. So Dune still made my top 10, but perhaps the consistency all the way throughout is something that some of the higher series on this list achieved with me. Number 7, Daemon by Daniel Suarez. So Daemon is my second and final duology on this list, and it is around 1,000 pages long, but I absolutely smashed my way through it. I would recommend this duology to fans of either Blake Crouch or Michael Crichton, because it combines elements of a techno-thriller with cyberpunk, as well as some detective sci-fi. In the story of Daemon, a famous video game developer passes away, and this triggers a series of mysterious deaths. So we have a detective and other people in law enforcement, and maybe some people acting outside the law, that are all looking into this, all with their own agendas, trying to get to the bottom of these mysteries. The first book has a real page-turner feel to it, and when I got to the end of every chapter, I felt like I just had to read the next one. Something pretty cool about this series is it's pretty much set in the present day, but it does a good job of kind of taking existing technologies and then extrapolating upon them, and things just get crazier and crazier as we go down this technological rabbit hole. The second book, Freedom TM, takes this formula and expands the scope. It's a techno-thriller on steroids as it just gets even bigger and even crazier. I would say that I slightly preferred the characters and character development in the first book, but I rate both of these books very highly. Some of the books, the series ahead of this one on the list, I might like a similar amount, but I gave them a little bit more credit for maintaining that high level over 3, 4, 5, 6 books. But if you're looking for a duology, an action-packed one at that, then you can't do too much better in my opinion than Daemon. Number 6, Revelation Space by Alistair Reynolds. Alistair Reynolds has written a lot within his Revelation Space universe. There are other books and sub-series, but I think most people consider the primary series to be his original trilogy, Revelation Space, Redemption Arc, and Absolution Gap, along with the prequel Chasm City. He did also write a 4th book in this series, The Inhibitor Phase, about 20 years later, which I do own, but I haven't read that one yet. So I consider that part of the main series. I guess when I read that, I can move Revelation Space up or down just a tiny bit, but for now, I'm going to focus on those original 4 books. Revelation Space resides on the harder end of the sci-fi spectrum. It takes all the things that I like about space opera and then adds some real science, as well as some pretty big concepts to the series, and this is what I love about science fiction, just having my mind expanded. Reading about things that I'm not sure I could ever imagine or conceive of myself, and I think it's just so cool that Reynolds is able to combine his scientific background with just immense levels of creativity. I have so much fun reading all of his books because I feel like every 50 pages or so, I just think, wow, that's cool, or wow, this is mind-blowing, or I'm totally tripped out right now and I'm on board for it. I think the writing in the first book, Revelation Space, which was Reynolds' debut novel, is a little bit stiff, although I do think that book pays off in the second half, and I think that Reynolds improves his writing throughout the series. The second book, Redemption Arc, is one of my all-time favorite books. It's almost a perfect space opera. And the third book was a little bit hit or miss. Absolution Gap, I like some of the ideas, but I think narratively it didn't quite stick the landing. And then there's the prequel Chasm City, which I think you can either read first or second after Revelation Space, but I would recommend reading it before Redemption Arc. I think it's one of the strongest in the series, and it's a little bit more focused. It's less of a sweeping space opera, and we get to focus on the city of Chasm City and some pretty kind of dark and gothic things that are going on in there. I'll have to give you guys an update after I read Inhibitor Phase, as well as the Prefect Dreyfus sub-series, starting with Aurora Rising. And for our next series... Sorry. Hello?
Hi Jonathan, this is Tim, and we're a big fan of your videos.
How very not specific.
We have this disruptive new product that, get this, is powered by AI.
That's interesting because in almost every sci-fi book, relying on AI usually goes terribly wrong.
Indeed. Well, we'd be interested in having you insert a 7-minute promo into...
Sorry about that. I do have to turn down a number of AI sponsorship offers, but if you're a human and you'd like to support the channel, go to the description and check out the perks of becoming a Patreon member, such as being able to vote for the Patron Pick of the Month. At the end of the video, I'll be spinning the Quantum Wheel in order to determine the Patron Pick for the month of February. Number 5, The Dark Tower by Stephen King. So The Dark Tower might not primarily be sci-fi. There are 7 books in the series, as well as the add-on The Wind Through the Keyhole, and it features fantasy, western, horror, romance, and sci-fi. I think anything that includes robots and AI and time travel is at least in some form science fiction, so I'm going to say it counts. This is an epic journey following Roland and his quartet on a quest on a journey to reach the Dark Tower. Now this is a wild series, each of the books are very different, there are some ups and downs, but the thing that makes it worthwhile is the characters. Stephen King is famously an excellent character writer, and with this being my introduction to Stephen King, I can wholeheartedly agree with that reputation. King has a remarkable ability to introduce a character, and within a page, you already have a sense of the type of person they are by how they act and how they speak. I love the dialogue in the Dark Tower series, as well as the slang and kind of words that he makes up and introduces. It's just so memorable, and he does a great job of using these to help convey the characters, as well as create a really unique atmosphere. I found these books very readable and I got through them rather quickly, but if you are a plot-focused reader, you might get a tad frustrated at times, as some of the books later in the series do get quite long, and it does seem like we get a little bit sidetracked by side quests on our journey to the Dark Tower. But if you just embrace all that the Dark Tower has to offer, I think a lot of these little tangents that Stephen King takes you on do pay off. They help flesh out the characters. I grew more emotionally attached to the characters. Book 4, Wizard and Glass, is primarily a flashback, which did not feel like a good idea to me, but reading the flashback, that is actually the storyline that made me fall in love with these characters. I went from liking Roland as a character to loving Roland as a character, and I think that made it more emotionally rewarding once we got back on the path of the beam. The Dark Tower has a lot of tie-ins to Stephen King's other works, although as someone that was new to King, I was able to read and enjoy The Dark Tower on its own. However, I will say that if you plan on reading Salem's Lot, it's best to do that before Book 5, Walls of the Calla, as there definitely would be some spoilers for Salem's Lot in that one. I feel like the first book, The Gunslinger, is not overly representative of the series, so I would recommend trying at least the first 2 books in the Dark Tower. I would say books 2, 3, and 4 tend to be people's favorites, and that's because King takes some pretty big swings, I think, in books 5, 6, and 7 that may or may not work for everyone. I could see why some people waiting for these books to come out when they were being written at the time might have started to get a little bit frustrated, but for me, someone that was lucky enough to just be able to read them all the way through after they had been published, it didn't bother me too much, and I'll be honest, a lot of those big swings I think ended up paying off, especially in book 7. I think it's the perfect ending to the Dark Tower series. It's one of my favorite books that I have ever read. There are some strange choices that King makes in the final book, but to me, it's still a masterpiece. A flawed masterpiece, yes, but any book that makes me cry 4 times is going to get a 10 out of 10 regardless of any shortcomings, because the high points were just that high. So pick up The Dark Tower, make sure you get at least the first 2 books, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Number 4, Jean Le Flambeur by Hannu Ryanemi. The Jean Flambeur trilogy is a post-singularity cyberpunk book set in a far future with some wild quantum technology. It is arguably the hardest sci-fi book on this list, but in some ways, the sci-fi is so hard, so futuristic, that it almost loops back around to being soft sci-fi again, because some of the abilities and the technology in this book almost seems like fantastical. Some of the characters feel like wizards or gods in this book, so while I think it might appeal to hard sci-fi fans, it might also appeal to fantasy fans at the same time, if they can get into it, because this is a tricky book to get into. There is so much technobabble, so much terminology, that I felt like I was kind of swimming upstream for the first 50 pages or so in this book. I probably read the word gavulot 30 times before I started to make sense of what a gavulot was, but while I was trying to put all of these puzzle pieces together, there was one thing that kind of anchored me in place, the anchor in the storm. And at the heart of that storm was a rather simple storyline. We have a thief trying to pull off a heist, and we have a detective trying to stop them. So we have this rather fun and tropey storyline that we can follow while trying to make sense of the rest of all the craziness. And once things come into place, some of those mysteries start to make sense. It's just such a fun read. I had an amazing time. I would have my mind blown by crazy ideas. We would go on a fun adventure. It was laugh out loud, funny at times. I think Hannu Rajaniemi did something really, really special with this book, which pays off. If you can just push through those early stages, it might not work for everyone, but I think it's worth the effort, because if it does click, I think like me, it might become one of your favorite series. I think books 2 and 3 are masterful as well, and if you enjoy the first one, I think it's definitely worth checking out the sequels. The world building is just phenomenal, and some really, really cool stuff happens, although I will say my favorite book is the first one, The Quantum Thief, just because of how satisfying the narrative is. Number 3, The Remembrance of Earth's Past by Cixin Liu. The Remembrance of Earth's Past, sometimes referred to as the Three Body Problem trilogy, is another hard sci-fi series, although I would say this one is a touch easier to get into than Jean Flambeur. Set against the backdrop of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, strange things start happening to prominent scientists, and these may be linked to a secret project that is sending messages out into space. If you are looking for a character-focused series, then this is not the series for you. What makes this series worth reading is the ideas. There are so many times throughout this trilogy where I just felt like my brain was bleeding. My mind was melted trying to make sense of just the cosmic horror that Cixin Liu managed to pack into this book. I think the first book does a good job of setting the stage for the series, but I actually preferred the sequels. The Dark Forest probably features 10 to 15 ideas that I think were novel-worthy on their own, and somehow he fits them all seamlessly together within a single narrative. Death's End gets even bigger and crazier from there. There are no limits to the sci-fi madness that Cixin Liu is able to come up with, and it's horrifying. This is not a series that made me feel good about the world or about people. It changed my view on space, the universe, and aliens, and that's what I read sci-fi for. I love learning new things. I love being challenged. I love pondering things that I may never understand, but I enjoy grappling with anyway, and that is something that The Remembrance of Earth's Past forced me to do. Yes, the characters can be a little thin. Yes, the writing can be a tad dry at times, but if you're looking for some ideas-driven sci-fi, in the spirit of, say, Arthur C. Clarke, but with some modern sci-fi influences as well as Chinese cultural influences, then I think The Remembrance of Earth's Past might hit for you. Number 2, Sun Eater by Christopher Rocchio. Sun Eater is a sci-fantasy sword and planet space opera told from the perspective of Hadrian Marlowe. He tells us the tale of how he would go on to destroy a sun, wiping out an entire race, killing billions, and how he is viewed as a hero by some and a monster by others. And if we want to find out what we think, well, we must go on this journey with him and find out for ourselves. The first thing that made me fall in love with Sun Eater was the prose. It is powerful and poetic, but without being dense or self-indulgent. It's just such a beautifully written series, and I enjoy all of the time that I spend with our main character, Hadrian Marlowe, Despite the emotional highs and lows, I'm always having a good time reading what's on the page. There are 6 books in the main Sun Eater series, with the 7th and final book due out sometime, hopefully within the next year. And this series is everything that I want in an epic space opera. The world building is incredible. The just breadth of the planets, the technologies, the religions, the characters, it's all so well layered and planned out, and things that Rocchio sets the scene for in the early novels really come to fruition in the later books. The books, I think, stand on their own quite well. They all have satisfying narratives, and they all have a distinct style, which I really enjoyed. But this is one overarching series where you can tell that Rocchio had a vision for where he wanted it to go in the end from the very beginning. Another thing I like about Sun Eater is how it manages to scratch different parts of my brain. It's quite thematically dense and philosophical, and there are a lot of historical and literary references for you to unpack in the series. However, it's also just a lot of fun when it comes to the action. The battles, the fight scenes had me on the edge of my seat every time, and I will say that there's a scene in Demon in White which is my all-time favorite fight scene. Rocchio is also a great character writer. I'm not sure this series would work so well if he wasn't able to pull off the character of Hadrian Marlowe. Hadrian is someone that we get to see grow up from a young, kind of ambitious, idealistic character to someone that goes through a lot of hardships, some successes, some failures, experiences some pretty unique and unforgettable things, and that really shapes his personality and perspective on the world, and you really feel the age of the character as we progress through the series. But this book isn't just all about Hadrian. I think he does an amazing job with the supporting characters as well. There are characters that you will grow to hate, characters that you'll grow to love. They will make you cry, they will make you angry. He's able to do a lot in not a lot of screen time for some of the supporting characters, and yet they're some of my favorite characters that I've read in all of fiction. I've enjoyed all the books in this series, but my favorites are probably Book 3, Demon in White, and Book 6, Disquiet Gods. I'm waiting pretty anxiously for the 7th and final book, and I'm sure I'm going to like it, but depending on how much I like it, I might have to move it from number 2 on my list. And number 1, The Hyperion Cantos by Dan Simmons. The Hyperion Cantos isn't the first sci-fi series that I fell in love with, but it is the series that made me want to start a YouTube channel. After reading this series, I thought, man, I have just got to find some people to talk to about this series, because it's just such an immersive world, and there are some experiences and ideas in this series that I think I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. The Hyperion Cantos can be split into 2 duologies, Hyperion and the Fall of Hyperion, and Endymion and the Rise of Endymion. In the first book, Hyperion, we follow 7 characters on a pilgrimage to the planet of Hyperion to visit the time tombs, which are moving backwards in time and are guarded by a mysterious character known as the Shrike. The book uses a Canterbury Tales style structure where each of the pilgrims tells their backstory, their reasons for wanting to travel to the planet of Hyperion, and each of these tales are told using a different subgenre of science fiction. So we get some sci-fi horror, we get military sci-fi, cyberpunk detective sci-fi, and more. So if you like a buffet of genres and styles and experiences and literary references and ideas all packed into one book, I think you're going to love Hyperion. Now the sequels are a little bit polarizing because they do depart from that structure. So if that's the main thing you enjoyed about Hyperion, I can see why the sequels might not work as well for you. But for me, I was just interested in learning more about this world, developing that story in the present timeline, and oh boy, do I think these books deliver in terms of being a grand space opera. The ideas are amazing, the characters just go on these such emotionally impactful arcs that I still think about some of the moments in these books and remember how impacted I was when reading them at the time. They feature some harder sci-fi elements, but also some rich themes and philosophical elements. And when it comes to the creativity, I honestly think this series reaches the peak of human imagination. Everything to do with the technocore, the ousters, the Templars, the Tree of Pain, the Shrike. There's just so much vivid imagery here and so many moments that I can just look back on, and I get the same sense of overwhelming enjoyment thinking about them as I did when I was reading the book. That's just how immersive this world is. I don't know if it's the world I'd most like to live in, but it's definitely the world I've enjoyed the most while experiencing it from the fortunate perspective as a reader. Simmons does make some strange choices in this series, and there is a little bit of retconning in the second duology, but similarly to how I describe the Dark Tower as being a flawed masterpiece, that's how I feel about the Hyperion Cantos. The high points were just so high, I'm prepared to forgive it any of these flaws. The series isn't perfect, and I know that I'm going out on a limb by saying that The Fall of Hyperion is my favorite in the Cantos. But for me, it reminded me of why I enjoy reading in the first place, and that's why for me, it's my favorite science fiction series of all time. So there you go, those are my 10 favorite sci-fi series of all time. It was tricky to narrow it down to just 10, so I might pin a couple of honorable mentions for you in the comments. And while making this list, I did notice that it skewed a little bit more towards modern sci-fi, and I think that might just be because of the trend towards more series in the modern era. But if you're a fan of classic sci-fi, don't worry, I am too. Feel free to check out some of my other videos where I talk about Arthur C. Clarke, Philip K. Dick, Clifford D. Simak, and many more of my other classic favorites. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and before you go, stick around as we find out what I'm going to be reading in the month of February as we spin the Quantum Wheel. Welcome to the Quantum Wheel featuring Tiny Jonathan, where the patron picks are both simultaneously picked and not picked until we observe a winner. Well, let's find out what I'll be reading in the month of February. Will I find a new favorite sci-fi series to add to my top 10 list? Let's find out. Looks like it's going to be The Girl with All the Gifts. It got the final tick. There you go. The Girl with All the Gifts. I believe this has a zombie element to it. Let me know if you've read this book. Let me know if you've enjoyed it. And yeah, check it out. If you haven't read it already, but it looks interesting, join me, because I'm going to be reading it in the month of February. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash or just gently click the subscribe button. And if you really enjoyed it, consider checking out the perks of becoming a Patreon member, where you can become one of my robots, androids, or cyborgs, like Nima and New Eden, Half Ogre, Zakawe, and the Top 10 Colin. And you can find more sci-fi content over here.